there's a version of life that most people are aiming for. Not luxury, not wealth, just normal. A place to live, a car that works, food in the fridge, bills paid on time, maybe a small amount left over at the end of the month. Nothing excessive, nothing unrealistic. And yet, for a growing number of people, even that version of life feels just out of reach. Not because they're reckless, not because they're lazy, but because the numbers no longer align the way they used to. Before we go further, we need to define what normal actually means. Not the highlight reel version of life. The baseline: a one-bedroom apartment, a reliable car, groceries, basic healthcare, utilities, and a handful of subscriptions, not because they're essential, but because modern life quietly includes them. That's it. No luxury travel, no designer purchases, no major indulgences, just a stable, functioning life. Now let's run the numbers. Not in theory, but in practice. Imagine someone earning around the median income. After tax, that might leave roughly enough to cover the basics, with some room on paper. But the moment expenses begin stacking, something changes. Housing comes first. Rent alone consumes a significant portion of income. Then comes transportation. Not just the car payment, but insurance, fuel, maintenance. The cost of simply being able to get to work. Then food. Nothing extreme, just standard groceries. And yet, over the past few years, the same basket costs noticeably more. Then healthcare, then utilities, then phone and internet, then subscriptions that quietly accumulate in the background. Individually, none of these seem unreasonable. Together, they leave far less than expected. At this point, there is still money left. But this is where reality begins to diverge from theory. Because life doesn't stop at fixed expenses. There are regular costs, unexpected repairs, medical bills, replacements, moments where something breaks and has to be paid for immediately. And this is where the system reveals its pressure, because the remaining margin is not designed to absorb shocks. It is designed to survive stability. From the outside, everything looks fine. Income is coming in. Bills are being paid. There is movement. But structurally, there is very little progress. Because progress depends on what remains after expenses. And for many people, the gap is either small or inconsistent. Savings begin to build, then disappear. Debt is reduced, then returns. Financial motion exists, but forward movement is limited. At this point, there is a common assumption that two incomes should solve the problem. And in some cases, they do improve the situation. But they also introduce new costs, larger housing requirements, more transportation, childcare. And childcare, in particular, changes the equation significantly, because it is not a small expense. It is often one of the largest, in some cases comparable to or even exceeding housing costs, which creates a situation where a second income is not increasing wealth. It is sustaining the system required to maintain the income. This is where the deeper pattern becomes visible, because this is not just about individual budgeting. It reflects a broader shift. Over time, core costs have increased at a faster rate than income. Housing, healthcare, education, transportation, all rising. At the same time, income growth has been slower, which creates a widening gap, not in a single category, but across the entire system. When multiple cost categories rise together, they don't just add pressure, They compress the margin, and margin is everything. It is the space where saving happens, where investing happens, where financial stability is built. When that space shrinks, everything becomes more fragile. This doesn't just show up in numbers. It shows up in behavior. Checking balances before spending, delaying decisions, avoiding risks, not because of poor discipline, but because the margin is too thin to absorb mistakes. And when that happens consistently, financial thinking becomes short-term by necessity. When you step back and look at the full picture, a pattern emerges. A normal life is no longer supported by average conditions. It increasingly requires above-average income or structural advantages, and that changes the baseline. What was once standard now requires leverage. This is also where traditional advice begins to lose effectiveness, because small optimizations do not offset large structural costs. Cutting minor expenses may improve efficiency, but it does not solve imbalance. The real impact comes from the largest categories: housing, transportation, income structure, and how those interact over time. So the question is no longer, how do I optimize within the system? It becomes, how do I position myself differently within it? Because financial outcomes are not only driven by effort, they are shaped by structure. Once this becomes clear, something changes. You stop expecting normal inputs to produce strong outputs, and instead, you begin focusing on leverage, creating more margin, protecting that margin, and gradually expanding it, not through extremes, but through direction. The reality is this: a normal life in 2026 is not as simple as it once was, not because people have changed, but because the structure around them has. Costs have shifted, timelines have shifted, expectations have shifted, and unless those changes are understood, it becomes easy to misinterpret the outcome, to assume the problem is personal, when in many cases, it is systemic. Once you see that clearly, you can stop trying to force progress in a system that resists it, and instead, begin building a position that works with it. Because in the end, financial progress is not about keeping up. It's about creating space and protecting it long enough for it to grow. If this video helped you see the structure more clearly, subscribe to Capital Explained for more deep, analytical breakdowns. Thanks for watching.